Customary, can everyone see my screen? Check. Great. I'd also recommend to move like the videos of people like to the top or to the bottom, because I have a lot of information on the left of the slides that might be distracting if you have the videos there. Cool. So let me start with saying, hi. I'm Alex. I come from the world or the nexus of social impact and strategic design. So I've worked for big design agencies. I worked with OpenIDEO. I used to work with Fuse Project, but always doing social impact projects. And then I've worked with big like NGOs, UN bodies, like those type of actors, but always doing design and innovation projects. And I got into it, I was doing human-centered design before I knew what it was. When I used to do my, like when I was doing like field work and stuff, the way I would always do it is like talk to people, come up with something easy that we could test quickly, learn from it, and then make it better. And then when I did my master's at UC Berkeley in international development, all of a sudden, like I discovered there was a word for this, there was a system for this, and it was called human-centered design. And so I started doing a lot of coursework in that. Through that, I met IDEO and started working with OpenIDEO and doing some stuff with them. And I just I always felt a little bit like, you know, in social impact, I never wanted to be one of those like people that had to wear like a suit and like, you know, do like program management. So I always thought I couldn't really work in that sphere because I was too on the creative side. And so finding the whole like service design, strategic design area for me has been really just like finding my home in this space. And I love it. Right now I work as a freelance designer. So I work with a lot of different clients like all over the world doing international development projects. But then I also work with like businesses to help them do more like co-creation, innovation within their processes. And then also like, how can you do social impact for profit? How can social impact not just be something relegated to the world of CSR? And I live in Barcelona. I'm an Acumen fellow right now there. And I'm president of an organization that we work with migrants and locals. It's called Singa Spain. And we build social cohesion through entrepreneurship and design. And I'm about to launch my own design studio in the next couple months with the founder of that organization. And so there'll be more coming on that, but looking at how we can use the power of connection and community to design better products, services, systems, and organizations. Cool, so let's dive in. Today we're going to talk about sex. And I chose this title because we're so squeamish about it. And before I even get into it, I wanted to just take a moment and have people share some things that they learned in school or from their friends or from family members about sex, sexuality, contraception that they found out later were completely untrue. So if you guys just want to like throw them in the comments for a second and maybe we can read a couple of them. Ooh. My mouse isn't really working. Oleg, can you see the comments?
That sex is something people shouldn't discuss out loud.
Yeah.
Parents didn't even teach it at all, learned entirely from school. I think for sure at some point someone told me you can't get pregnant while on your period. Sex is dangerous.
Yeah, so I mean, these are just like a small sampling. How do I close this? Oops. I don't know how to close the chat. Hold on one second. Hold on, sorry. There we go. Okay. So those are just like a small sampling of, I mean, those aren't even the worst. There's much more like specific myths, like, oh, like you can get pregnant if you kiss, like all of that. And even though we think like, you know, those of us that got more sex education think that like we know all the truth about that and we actually have the facts. One of the things I learned through this project is that even like the public health professionals like had some things that they were sharing that weren't actually true. So there's just like a lot of misinformation about out there. So this project was based in Vietnam, and the specific context of Vietnam is really interesting. It's like a land of, you guys have heard of pho, the like amazing soup, there's amazing coffee, there's all this like beautiful things happening in Vietnam, but it also has the highest abortion rate in the world. And so 40% of women will have an abortion in their life. And on average, women have 2.5 abortions. And 70% of these secret abortions are for teenagers. And at first, like if you first read that statistic, you'd be like, oh, well, family planning options must not be available. They must not be able to get condoms or like pills or like IUDs or whatever. But actually all of that is available there. And it's highly available. And so like the specific case of Vietnam is that Vietnam up until like 1986 was quite a poor country and was very traditional. And since the 80s, they've gone through a process of like rapid economic development and are now considered a lower middle income country. But what that has created is like the people who are parents right now, they've lived in this like very, very traditional society. And then there's this like new generation who have access to things like Tinder and like TikTok and like, you know, all the stuff that we have access to. And like are aware of like hookup culture and all of that, but they were raised by these really, really traditional parents. So there's a lot of shame around sex and sexuality, which exists in every single culture, but it's particularly pronounced in Vietnam. And so what ends up happening is that it's more okay to not protect yourself, to not access like pills or other types of contraception, and then go get an abortion, than it would be to just go to the store and buy condoms. So they have this like really, really high rate, which is incredible. And it's also a great place for design because it's very behavior based. So I worked with a large public health NGO, and they brought me on, and they work globally to look at how might we reduce unintended pregnancy amongst youth in Vietnam. And this organization, I'm not going to name them because I didn't tell them I was doing this. So, but this organization, they wanted to do service design because they have it more baked into their organization ethos. They've seen the power of it in a lot of different cases. They even have like a persona that represents the beneficiary within their organization. And they've also seen the power of it to actually create new things that work. And so they've created all these programs with donors where they can actually invest time in the design phase. And so it was a really nice project in that respect, because a lot of times you get brought on to do service design and design research, but it's more like for show, you know, and you don't really get to dive in, you don't really get to fail. But in this, we have a longer timeline specifically for that. And it's because they've done it before and they've seen the results. So it makes it a lot easier to work in that type of environment. And the staff is like semi-aware of what design is. So it's a really nice environment to work in. And the process was first like connect with the problem. And of course, like I live in Barcelona and this project is in Vietnam. I don't know how many of you guys have done international work before, but it's like, there's always the problem of like language and context and like all of that. So what we decided to do to be able to kind of break through that, and especially because we're talking to youth about sex, and like I like to think that I'm still youthful. What I discovered in this project is I'm no longer considered a youth. But so we recruited a team of 16 youth facilitators, you know, that are from Vietnam. They speak the language. They look like the people that we're talking to. And basically worked with them to remote manage a 2-month human-centered design research process. And this is interesting as well, because I think now, like with COVID, everyone's like freaking out because it's like, oh my God, we have to do everything remotely. There's a lot that can be learned from the international development space, because we've been having to do that for a long time. And did like, once I actually got in country, basically they did all this research, we had the results of it, had some insights from it, and then I basically went in and did spot checking once I was in country, just making sure, because there is always like a margin of error when you have people that haven't really been trained in this, making sure that the results seem to hold. So I went in and did contextual interviews, I did observation, all of that, but on a much shorter timeline than the 2-month period that we had them out there. And then the other key thing within this is like custom research tool design. So we'll talk about this further on in the presentation, but when you're talking about things like sex, you really have to create tools that make people feel comfortable to talk about it. There's not trust around this topic just because you have someone who's the same age. So really thinking about like, how can you create distance and space around this topic so that people actually engage with it with you. And then after that all happened, I was in country and we did a 2-week design sprint, which was interesting because there's like 2 goals of the design sprint, which makes it kind of hard. And I'm sure some of you have experienced this before. We want really innovative, amazing ideas, and we want you to train our team in how to do design at the same time. and so you kind of have these conflicting things where you're like facilitating a training, but you also need to come up with really amazing, groundbreaking ideas. And you need to do it in 2 weeks, and you need to work like crazy hours until that happens. But it was really good. At first I was a bit skeptical because I was like, oh man, like having to manage a team of 16 girls and like, how is this gonna work? But actually, really relying on them as sources of information and like letting them have creative input, they all kind of just took to it like fish in the water. And so it ended up being really, really useful. And there's like no way I could have done it without the 16 of them. And a kind of secondary impact of all this was that we were able to empower them. We were able to teach them new design skills that they can then go and use in other projects. And then we moved into try it phase. So basically I'll talk more about like the concepts later, but we came up with a set of 5 concepts, and built prototypes from storyboards to physical products to like role playing, and took them out and tested it with the group, and then refined it and then tested it again, as you're all aware of. And then the next phase, which is kind of where we're at now, is like, let's make it real. And so we're moving 4 of the concepts into minimum viable products. And now they're not like 4 separate concepts, they're an ecosystem that we're also building a brand for. And then also moving it into like, okay, how do we move the partners around and start those conversations now so that when I hand over the project, basically the team can already launch it. And so it's like, it's also taking the human-centered design, like design research principles, and doing that with the partners to understand what's their values, like how do we create value for them in this whole ecosystem. And that's kind of where we're at now. I'll stop there for a second and see if there's any questions or anything.
Yes, I have got some questions from my side, and again, anybody from the audience can type your questions in the chat so I can pass it to Alex. Alex, I have a question about this team of people. You named them facilitators. What was actually their role? What did they do in the project?
Yeah, so I mean, they were the enumerators in the beginning. So I made these custom research tools, and then we trained them in how to do them. And they went out and did like a 2-month research process using those tools with like 3 different user groups. And then when I came in country, they were like my like crack team that the whole design sprint was with them. And so it was basically having to get all of the information, it was documented, but it's all in Vietnamese, and they're not going to translate hundreds and hundreds of direct pages for me. So it was like having to get all of the information that was in these 16 people's heads out and in a way that was in different, like created in a way that it's around frameworks so that you can actually understand it, like not just like giant room filled with Post-its, even though that was kind of what happened too.
Yes, so basically they were also doing the interview part with the interview or some interaction part with the target audience, right?
Yeah, so they did the initial research, and then when I was in country, they were translating for me, doing more research, and then they were in the workshop with me. And then when we went out and did prototyping, they were like doing like, because I mean, obviously I don't speak Vietnamese, so I have to hand that over to them. And now that we're in this minimum viable product stage, they're also part of that. Like I'm having different people run different parts of it.
Okay, super. And one more question, which is not related with the first one. You mentioned that the organization you worked with or worked for in Vietnam, they are already quite advanced in human-centered design. Well, I would ask, how come? So what helped them and how come they have it already?
I'm not exactly sure how they began. I think that I don't want to say because I'm not exactly sure how they started liking design. I know that they have worked with like IDEO, they've worked with like other organizations, like staff goes to like D school. So somewhere along the line, they did a project where they saw the benefit of it. And because of that, they've just kind of rolled with it. I think international development in general is like a lot of organizations are embracing design and innovation and all that. But I've worked with like varying levels of understanding what that means on like a team level. And these guys definitely have a much higher understanding and like more fully embrace the ethos of what it means.
Super, thank you. And there is a question from Anand. What was the key action that helped you to get your facilitators up to speed with design research mindset? So how did you prepare the team? Or how did you recruit it maybe?
So yeah, I mean the recruitment process was complicated, but I mean mainly the thing that we're looking for is people who have some sort of research skills already and speak English pretty well, because it's actually quite hard to find both sides. And during the workshop, I mean I always do design as like a learning by doing thing, and so I didn't really, because of the format of the project where like the scope wasn't actually to do a design research training, it was to like do the project. And so what I did was I taught them what they needed to know to be able to run this process with me. So I didn't go too much in the theory. We never did like the wallet game, anything like that. It was just like, okay, we're going to do this together. It's going to be very, very step by step. And then that way they just learned as they were doing it.
Super, thank you. Thank you.
I think that's key, and something I found across projects is like frameworks are key. So that it's just like, okay, this is the activity, like here are the instructions for the activity, fill that out. Okay, here's the next activity. And you explain it as you go along, like why we're doing this and how it's related. But that way you don't have to get so lost in like theory. And then the other thing that I didn't mention that worked really well, I've gotten very frustrated with design sprints personally. And I find that like, especially the brainstorming part really like kind of feels like we're always just coming up with ideas that already exist. And so we did like an interesting take on the round robin format, where we started doing round robin, had everyone just get whatever was in their brain out for a minute, which is, I would say, is like the surface level stuff that already exists. And then what we did was we introduced like what already exists, where has this been done in other places and done well. So did like a bit of like a landscape analysis, like, oh, look, there's this emerging trend and there's this type of technology and like blah, 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 and gave them all of that. And was like, you know, we don't need to copy this, but like, let's keep this in mind and see what we can learn. So we're not building from nothing. And then I created these cards called diversity cards. And I'm sure you guys have seen the brainstorming prompt cards. It was brainstorming prompt cards, but like the goal is to drive innovation through thinking about how to incorporate different user groups. Like for example, how might someone interact with your solution? And so like even though the person that you're trying to reach might not be blind, thinking through that makes you think about your whole idea in a different way. So introduce those. And so all that, like, push it further and further and further.
Thank you. Well,
shall I go on, or?
Yes, I think we can go on.
All right, cool. Tips with you guys.
Alex, can you hear me? Sorry.
Can you hear me?
There was poor connection and we couldn't hear you. Now, yes. Now I think we can hear you.
Okay, I'll turn on my hotspot in case that happens again. Okay, yeah. So these are some tips in general for designing for the intimate, which could be sex, but it could be other types of intimate subjects that people might not want to share around. As a designer, as the outsider, the more you can make yourself invisible in the process, the better. And so having the youth facilitators, you know, was so key in that, because I was able to like disintermediate, you know, like I'd usually be around like listening and having like someone on the side translate for me, but like letting them actually kind of run the process got us way better results. The other is create space around the topics. And a great way to do that is to either create like scenarios with characters that aren't the person themselves, because like it's a lot easier to talk about like Sarah, what should Sarah do in this situation than saying like what you would do, or even like simple things like asking like what your friends would do in this situation. And you do kind of compromise a bit the idea of like, oh, they're putting it into a hypothetical, but it makes them more comfortable around talking about it. You can see some of the character designs that we did in the prototyping there. And meet people where they are. So this picture is us in like a little like ice cream shop. And so we were trying to interview teenagers, high school teenagers about all of this stuff. And so we went to the ice cream shop, sat at their little tables with them, you know, we're in their space where they're comfortable being, and that facilitates a lot more conversations. The other is be prepared to be surprised. It was really funny because like me and the NGO colleague I was working with on this, like we kept being so nervous to ask about sex. Like we kept being like, oh, like if we say this, they're not going to want to talk about it, and like if we say this, it's going to make them uncomfortable. And then we found that like they were actually really excited to have someone ask them about this, because nobody had ever asked them about this. And so that's one of our youth facilitators, you know, making a box full of condoms. Like in the end, I think we were more squeamish than they were. So be prepared to be surprised about, you know, what the actual attitudes are. And then the other is show, don't tell. So, you know, asking someone directly about any of their like contraception, sex, and sexuality practices, like everyone's going to say that, oh yeah, like I'm perfect with this. Like I would never screw that up. But when you put them in a situation where they actually have to like act it out, or they have to like describe it in a different way, then you get much better results. And these are like kind of design principles across the board, but they're particularly important when you're designing for subjects that people are not comfortable talking about. And so through this whole process, we did a lot of conversations and we got some pretty interesting insights. I'm just going to share a couple of them. One was about learning about sex and contraception needs to be fun, relevant, and delivered where closed youth already are. So one thing we found is that like in the spectrum, it doesn't matter on your age, people are either more open about sex or they're more closed about sex. And that comes from a variety of factors of like, you know, how you were raised, etc. And you have to design for both if you really want to reach people. So the ones that are more closed, like they're like, we're not having sex, like sex isn't on my radar. But so they never seek information about it, but the information that they absorb passively during this time period where they feel like this isn't for me, it's not relevant, actually is the information that they'll use later, because they never feel comfortable to seek that information. So you do need to reach them while they're in this passive, like closed state. And then the more open youth, the ones that are more comfortable about it, they need to learn about sex where they already are looking for romance, because the traditional channels like parents, biology class, whatever, don't really stick with them, but the sexy ones do. So we saw a lot of people were learning about sex from like porn. A lot of people were learning about sex from like, there's these like Chinese romance novels that everyone reads. And so like, how can you mimic, unfortunately they wouldn't let us make porn videos, but like how can you mimic those like visual styles, etc., in the intervention so that people already identify with it. And so like one of the things we came up with to respond to this insight was a series of gamified humorous events. So instead of like going to learn about sex and it's just like some teacher like droning on and on, we work with YouTube influencers, which already have a huge impact on the population, and we bring in experts, but experts that are funny, you know, that know how to kind of walk on that line, and then gamify the event. So they're actually going on like quests around the event where they end up discovering different things about sex and sexuality, and keeping like the design principle of anonymity throughout, so they're able to ask and answer anonymous questions to the panelists. And then another insight that we saw was, so timid or inexperienced youth need to be able to learn about and access sex and family planning without feeling detected, because although they consider the subject deeply private, the purchase and learning experience often occur in public space. So this is the idea of like, and it's interesting because like the level of privacy in Vietnam is super high. Like people don't even, like boys, like don't talk about sex with their friends because they feel embarrassed. Like the more closed ones, the more open ones do. And we heard a lot that people will travel to the other side of the city to purchase condoms because they're afraid if they go into the pharmacist like near where they live that someone will see them. And we heard the word detected a lot, like, oh, I'll be detected, I'll be detected. So one of the things we came up with to respond to that was the exit door. And what it essentially is like a box that looks like any other medication, and you can go in and ask for it. And inside of it, it has condoms and emergency contraception and like instructions that use the Chinese romance visual style for how to use both of those. And so like they can go in, buy it, and leave without anyone ever knowing what they're buying. And then when they get home, they have their whole little kit. And one of the things that we realized through all of this is it's not a silver bullet solution. Like there's two things that need to happen at the same time. We need to respond to where people are currently at. So the feeling of like, I don't want to go and purchase condoms because I'm so scared of being detected that like, I just won't go. And we also need to try and push the narrative to a more like sex positive environment. And so the only way you can really do that is by creating an ecosystem of products, services, and people that all kind of feed into each other. And so the final concept is to build this ecosystem. I'll show you the logo for it in the next one. It's called Love Voyage. And the idea with all of it is like, we don't want to, and nothing can say sex, nothing can say family planning, nothing can say contraception. We focus on like love and relationships. So that way more timid youth who are afraid, like who don't identify themselves with sex and sexuality will feel okay accessing it, because love and relationships are safe topics, but sex and sexuality aren't. And so what we have is like, we have these events, which act as like a way to build community. It's a place for people to explore safely. And it's also a place for people to get more accurate information. And then we have online gurus, which we're working with. There's already some existing profiles out there, like Facebook profiles, that are sharing information about sex and sexuality. But what we discovered is like those guys don't even know where to get the information, and they spend a lot of time trying to find accurate information and they're not even sure. So instead of like starting our own guru program, which takes a lot of time, and then you have to build trust, etc., we look for where the trust already was and how we could amplify that. And so the gurus, basically, it's like training them, giving them the most accurate information, and then also bringing them under this network of or under the umbrella of the network. So the benefit for them is that like, oh, we're going to promote your profile, we're going to invite you to MC these events, so they get a benefit out of it as well. And in turn, they promote the rest of the network. They answer questions for youth, and we give them the information so they can answer accurately. And then the YouTubers are kind of part of the guru, but they're like hosting events and participating in that way, which allows us as well to amplify our reach. And for them, it's a whole new kind of like market they can move into. And then working with pharmacists, like the pharmacists are interesting because in general, the pharmacists are a big roadblock. They have a lot of judgment. They share inaccurate information. One of them told us that like having sex under 18 was illegal, which is not. It's like, I think it's like 14 or something in Vietnam. And so like finding the bright spots in the pharmacist network where people like are already, like we're basically mystery shopping pharmacists to find which ones treat the youth nicely. And then bringing those into the network, training them on how to have sensitive conversations with youth, training them on the exit door product, which is the box, and giving them the most accurate information. So then they're under the network as well. And then finally, there's the box itself, the exit door, which is the product, which allows people to actually purchase contraception in a way that they feel comfortable with. And all of these things kind of flow into each other, promote each other, et cetera. So it's all working together. And so this is like kind of where we've been at. We're making it real right now. We have the logo, we have the box. You can see the box there. We've got the whole ecosystem plotted out. And like we were starting to launch it when COVID-19. I'm sure so many of you have experienced this as well. And I think like for me, it's been really interesting because you know, it ground things to a halt for a minute just because everyone was in like full panic mode and couldn't do anything. But it's also made us rethink our model. First of all, I was supposed to go back and do a whole nother design sprint and like blah, blah, blah. As someone who works in international development, I think COVID-19 is a really great experiment in how could international development actually start decolonizing itself a little bit, and how can we be supporting more and more local partners to be doing the work from afar. So I think this is something that needed to happen in international development, and now we're being forced to do it. So a lot of the stuff that I would have gone and done in country, I'm figuring out how could I support a local person to do that and train them up in it and, you know, help them analyze it. And I think before we just weren't forced to do that, so we didn't do the work, and now we're forced to do that. And the other thing that happened, of course, is like, oh, hey, a huge part of our thing is like, we're going to do events. There are people are going to be able to go to pharmacies to purchase this. And so with the events, we've just rethought it all, and we've decided to bring it online. And what's interesting is at first it was like, oh, this is a huge challenge. But then actually, like when we were going through the whole process of moving all this stuff to respond to COVID, I actually realized that this is like a big opportunity. Like we probably should be doing online events anyways, because that can then eventually feed into the in-person events and make them bigger. And then as far as the pharmacists, we're like, okay, well, if people can't go to the pharmacy and pick up this box, like how could we have it delivered to them? And they have a thing that's kind of like Uber Eats, Glovo in Vietnam called Grab. And so we're like, okay, well, how could we work with Grab to have them be able to deliver these products? Which, you know, in the research, people said they didn't really want delivery that much, but in the end, I think it actually could end up being a better channel for delivery. So all of that to say, and I think like across everyone's projects, there is opportunity in this crisis, and it's just to kind of look at it with that perspective of like, okay, this is a new design constraint that's forcing me to think in a different way that I didn't have to think in before, which could actually lead to more innovative strategies. So that's kind of been my take on it. And so we're now back on track with everything online and doing it this way. So we'll see how all of it comes out. And that's it. I wanted to stop there and invite more questions. And
I'll start with a small comment. I've heard that in Ukraine, after the quarantine announcement, the sales of condoms were up by 30%.
Yeah,
I
sex
believe
toys
she,
as well.
yes, and I believe, and YouTube consumption also rose significantly. So it could be that you actually delivered your message to more people.
Yeah.
So it could be in a way beneficial. I have some questions. The first one, you partially answered it, but I want to clarify it. How did you recruit the people whom you interviewed and with whom you later prototyped? Did
Yeah,
you tell them
so
the topic in advance, for example?
we told them we wanted to talk about love and relationships. Yeah, so love and relationships were the keywords that replaced sex and family planning across the board. I think like for recruitment, it's always like working with the NGO partner is essential. You can do it without the NGO partner. You need to do it through social media, but it could never be like me outreaching. It always needs to be like a local person that has those connections. But it was basically just through the youth facilitators and through the NGO that we were able to recruit a decent amount of people to talk to. We were looking at university students, high school students, and factory workers, which is also interesting because the factory worker, university and high school students in Hanoi, similar, it's like one becomes the other, more or less. Factory workers, totally different population. Like they come from rural Vietnam, much more traditional values. And those are the people that don't want to access information. But you can still reach them with things like they watch YouTube, so you can still reach them. You just got to think of it from a different way. And so it's good when you're designing to have those kind of polar people, because if you design something that works for both, it's quite scalable.
Super. Were some people who refused to continue the conversation?
No, and that's what I was saying, be prepared to be surprised. Like a lot of people, and this is like, we had the youth facilitators and me and my colleague there in the interviews that I was doing. And, I didn't feel like they would never talk about it from a first person perspective. In the interviews, like no one was ever like, I've had sex, like ever. But everyone would talk about their friends. And they were quite open about that. And a lot of them at the end were like, thank you so much for talking to me about this. And a lot of them, because we let them ask questions at the end, a lot of them were like asking us for information, because they had no place to get this information. So that's where I was surprised, where it's like they wouldn't talk about themselves, but by putting in the second or third person, they were able to share a lot. And we got pretty intimate with a lot of them.
There is a question which is, what about a layer of personas who do not associate sex with romance and relationship?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of in there, like they're easy to attract to this type of stuff. So you don't really need to say sex for them, like they'll come. It's like love and relationships is pretty baked into that. But also in Vietnam, those people are like the minority. Like we did talk to some people like who, like we talked to one guy and mentioned like friends with benefits, and he was like, you guys have just blown my mind. So, and like Tinder exists, like there's like people use Tinder, like they're aware of it, but it's more around like finding a relationship. The other thing that they do, the men do, is like there's a lot of like going to sex workers. A lot of men have their first experiences with sex workers, which is another interesting point of intervention that we were thinking about. It was like, and there's a lot of love hotels, like one night where you spend one night in a hotel, you just pay, or like you pay by the hour. So like you can kind of meet everyone where they are in that respect, but we didn't focus too much on the people that were having one night stands or like just having, casual sex, because they generally also seem to be, because like I said, the contraception is out there. So the people that were having more sex were buying condoms, were using the pill. It was more like the people who were so ashamed and shy about it that were making bad decisions.
Another question, did you consider actually using schools to disseminate information between youth?
Well, so the event is going to be hosted at universities and high schools and stuff like that. But what we want to stay away from is schools as the source of information, because it's not like sexy. You know, it's like nobody wants to learn about something sexy from their school, you know. So even like also with the NGO, like the NGO's role in all of this is not to be the face of it. The NGO is, we're taking a step back, and the gurus are the face, the influencers are the face, other youth are the face. So it's not like an older person telling you, it's like other youth, which people trust more.
Super. What about the let's say other experience? But because probably solving this issue about the unwanted pregnancy is not, I mean, it's not the first time the international organizations solve this issue. Were you also studying other similar projects in other parts of the world, and how much applicable they are from one country to another?
Yeah, so there's a great body of work that's being created around this. In this project, we also want to feed into that and have the stuff that we're doing be able to be used other places. But for example, like IDEO recently published like Designing with and for Girls, this great like guide that has like, and it's also, if any of you are going to do a project like this, like I highly recommend it. Like I used it as a reference when I was designing this whole project, because like they have great tools in there, and they have a lot of great case studies. And what we did was like those case studies that have worked in other places, that's what that's what I was sharing when in the innovation, in like before the ideation process, was like, okay guys, like these are the things that are happening in other places that work. Let's remember what we learned in the research, like not put away our insights, but look at the insights that we learned and these other things, like what could we take from those and apply here? Because a lot of this, like I was laughing the whole time, because a lot of the things that we were discovering are like universal truths around how people feel about sex and how weird we all are about it. So I think like especially in these type of projects, like it's always going to be different based on the local context, but there's definitely global learnings that can be shared across regions, whatever,
Super,
population.
thank you. There are two questions which are very similar. How do you measure a success of this project? How would you measure it? What are the KPIs or other metrics?
Yeah, I mean, we're on that right now. The success is basically how well the ideas that we came up with work. You know, like how many people are like participate in the event, how many people actually purchase contraception. We're using like discount cards to track that. How many people interact with the gurus? What type of questions are they asking? So those type of things.
There is a question about the family. You mentioned that there is a big gap between the generations in Vietnam, but I mean, did you somehow study the role families play in all the ecosystem and how you can leverage it or vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because this is one of those universal truths that a lot of women are like, oh no, like my boyfriend makes the decisions about contraception. Like if we're gonna have sex, I just rely on him to come with whatever we need. And so there's a lot of that kind of attitude. And then what's interesting is the girls are the ones that are actually informing themselves. So the girls will go to the biology class. The girls will, you know, obviously because women can get pregnant, so there's a little bit more of an incentive. But then the guys, the way that they interact with this type of information is they don't want to be taught it. You know, it feels like weird for them to be taught it. They'll skip the classes, they won't go, but they are the ones that are actually being responsible for getting this information. And so that's why we wanted to create this event series where it's just actually like a fun event. And so people will come because it's a fun event, not because it's like, oh, like let me learn how to protect myself. Like that doesn't sound very much fun, you know. So, and through this information sharing and seeing that there's like gurus that are, you know, influencers that are talking about this and all of that, and there's other people in their community that are interested in this and they actually learn accurate information, then that will influence their behaviors. And also, like, the idea with the event is men and women are together learning about this. And that's something really important, because there's a lot of like fear around having these conversations with your partner, and a lot of times we separate boys and girls in like sex ed classes, and it's really important that people are comfortable talking about this with each other. And so that's kind of what we were trying to push.
I just realized that we were separated in my school.
Yeah, and mine too. It was like, your bodies are changing, never talk to each other about it.
Funny. Well, thank you very much. There is a good question on reflecting about the project and the work already did. What was the biggest challenge, and maybe what would you do differently now after you know everything you know?
For me, the biggest challenge is always time. Like, to do a 2-week design sprint, and you're basically going like 9 to like 7 or 8 p.m. every day, and you're expected to be, I mean, I'm sure other people who do service design have lived this, where it's like you're expected to synthesize everything and then come up with amazing ideas in 2 days, and then come up with amazing prototypes for those ideas in like half of a day. And it's just like go, 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 go. Where I really think to drive real innovation, we need more reflection time. And so, like, in my opinion, the ideation process should be like a week at least, you know, where you can really go out and like push yourself with different activities to go farther and farther and farther, because there's only so far you can go when you're doing it in like 3 or 4 hours. So I think that was a challenge. And then the other challenge, of course, is like not being there. And so, like, you know, having to bring people, like, since I've been gone, you know, we had all the insights, we're all on board, this is what we learned. And then as we go developing the project, there's definitely like drift. And we have to keep bringing the team back to like, okay, but remember, we learned this. So like, that is cool, but it doesn't have to do with this. And so we have to come back to this. And so there is definitely a lot. And I feel like, you know, over time you get it tighter and tighter and tighter, but definitely in the beginning, there's this tendency for people to keep diverging at a point where it's like, no, we can't do that anymore. You know, we learned, and we can learn more when we test, but right now we're just focusing on building based on what we learned.
Super, thank you. And why was the time for the sprint so much limited? Was it just the?
I mean, honestly, 2 weeks is a long time for a sprint. Usually, like that, like in the world, in the projects that I've done, 2 weeks is like the longest that you'll get. It's the way that we think about these processes. I think that because everyone knows about like Google design sprints and like all of that, it's like that is now considered the best way to do this. And so that's what projects scope for. You know, it's like, okay, we've got a budget, you come for 10 days, this is what we're doing. Like, especially international development projects, you get off the plane, you're jet lagged, it's like, okay, tomorrow we're launching into all of this. So it's like, I think that like as a community, as a service design community, we really should push to demonstrate the power of slow thinking, and that, you know, like not getting caught up in bureaucracy, but having time for reflection really helps coming up with more innovative ideas.
It's true. Okay, I see no more new questions. If there are some, guys, you need to type it faster. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for openly talking about this sensitive and intimate topic. It was really great, and I mean,
yeah,
you are fantastic in doing this job. Thank you very much. It was,
thank
I mean,
you. Yeah, and like if anyone has Alex,
Alex, sorry, we didn't hear you last time. So if anyone.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I was just saying, if anyone like has other things or they want to talk about this more, you can find me on LinkedIn, Alex Alden, ALDEN, or my email is down on the screen.
Yes, yes, it's on the slide. Thank you very much. And one more question from the audience probably. Will you be able to share the slides?
Possibly. I mean,
Possibly. Okay, we'll see. Thank you.
This is recorded though. We're recording this now.
Yes, we are recording it. It's true.
So we can share the recording.
Super. Again, thank you very much. It was a fantastic case and fantastic presentation. I enjoyed it very much. And guys, see you tomorrow. Tomorrow is our last evening, and we will be talking about like a new battleground for the service design, which is employee experience. And Katerina will be sharing her first-hand experience together with their HR. So basically, it will be two-side presentation about the hot topic of the service design. So see you tomorrow. See you tonight. And Alex, thank you again, and good luck, everybody.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.